is a photograph of Soulmate in Aunt Pat's Bay at 7:41 p.m. This is exactly the time that Brian says the sea was angry, my friend, and I couldn't get to my wife. The raging sea, the 2 to 4 foot waves, and her head was disappearing in between, and I couldn't hear, and the wind was blowing, and we got separated, and I only had one oar, and I'm a Marine. Liar, liar, pants on fucking fire.
She was not supposed to be missing. Lynette Hooker was 55 years old, a mother, a sailor, a woman from Michigan who believed in second chances, including the chance to start completely over. She and her husband Brian had been together for roughly 25 years, and somewhere along the way they made a decision that most people only dream about. They sold nearly everything they owned. They packed their lives into a 46-foot sailing sloop called the Soulmate, and they set out to see the world. They documented it all on social media under the name The Sailing Hookers, sunsets, anchorages, open skies, freedom. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked like the perfect life. But freedom has a way of hiding what is happening behind closed doors. Lynette was warm, generous, devoted. Her daughter Carly Aylesworth was the center of her world. The two texted constantly. That kind of closeness that distance never really breaks. She loved diving. 2 days before she disappeared, she and Brian filled their scuba tanks at Great Guana Cay. That detail will matter later. On the evening of April 4th, 2025, Lynette Hooker was last seen at the Abaco Inn on Elbow Cay in the Bahamas. Security cameras captured her there. Witnesses saw her. She was alive. That is the last confirmed sighting of Lynette Hooker. What happened next depends entirely on who you ask. Brian Hooker says his wife bounced off the back of a small dinghy and was swallowed by the sea. He says he tried to save her. He says he yelled for an hour. He says he drifted for 9 hours before washing up at a boatyard at 4 in the morning. According to the evidence, almost nothing he has said holds up. This is the story of what really happened to Lynette Hooker. April 4th started like most other days. The couple had been anchored at Aunt Pat's Bay near Elbow Cay, a calm, sheltered stretch of water, protected from open ocean conditions, not a place known for sudden dangerous seas. That morning they went to Tahiti Beach, a local spot where a bar sits literally in the water. They were there for hours. Then they moved to the Abaco Inn, where they continued their evening. Security cameras captured both of them there. By the time they left, it was getting late. Brian says they left around 7:30 to take the short dinghy ride back to the Soulmate, half a mile. 10 to 15 minutes under normal conditions. They never made it back. At least, that is what Brian says. Here is his account. Brian says conditions suddenly changed. 15 to 22 knot winds, a sudden blow. He says, Lynette bounced off the back of the dinghy and went into the water. He threw a seat cushion toward her. Not one of the life preservers stored under the seats. A cushion they sat on. An oar pin broke. He lost an oar. He threw out the anchor. He yelled for an hour. He never heard her voice. 2 boats passed. He fired flares. Neither stopped. Eventually, he paddled toward shore. He says the wind carried him 4 miles to Marsh Harbor. 9 hours of drifting. He washed up at 4 in the morning on Easter Sunday. He bushwhacked through brush, knocked on 2 doors, nobody answered, flagged a car. The driver listened and drove away. Eventually reached the boatyard where a security guard named Edward Smith finally got help rolling. That is Brian Hooker's story. On the surface it sounds like tragedy, a cascade of failures. Brian's own words. But when investigators and eyewitnesses began pulling that story apart, almost nothing survived. Not the weather, not the timeline, not the flares, not the dry bag, not what she was wearing, not where she was swimming, not the 9 hours, not the 2 boats, not the man who drove away. Not one piece of physical evidence from the water supporting the idea that Lynette Hooker ever went overboard from that dinghy. Not one. Every lie has a pressure point. In Brian Hooker's case, there are many. The weather. Brian described dangerous conditions, 15 to 22 knot winds, massive swells, a sudden blow that came up out of nowhere. Multiple witnesses in that exact area that evening described something completely different. Calm water, still conditions, a perfect anchorage night. Ashley Banfield traveled to the Abacos and stood in the exact spot. She reported seeing photographs and video taken at that precise time. The water was calm, but it gets worse than witness accounts. There is now a photograph, an actual photograph of the soulmate sitting in Aunt Pat's Bay at 7:41 p.m. on April 4th, the exact time Brian claims the seas were dangerous. The exact time he says Lynette bounced off the back of the dinghy in 15 to 22 knot winds. The water in that photograph is flat, completely still, no waves, no dangerous conditions. No sudden blow. That is not a witness recollection. That is not someone's interpretation of events. That is a photograph, time-stamped, showing the exact location. At the exact moment Brian Hooker says his wife was lost in raging seas, there were no raging seas. So Brian, if the water was flat and calm and you are a former Marine, why couldn't you reach your wife? The timeline. Brian told authorities Lynette went overboard around 7:30. He told the security guard it was 7 mile. He told others it was 8 mile when it was dark. At 7 in the Abacos in early April it is not dark. Daylight. Other sailors outside. The most social hour on the water. Nobody heard Brian yelling for an hour. Not one witness in 6 weeks. The 3 versions of where Lynette was swimming. This is where Brian's story falls completely apart. To fire and rescue, he said Lynette was swimming south toward the soulmate, 1,000 yards away. To the security guard at the boatyard, he said she was swimming north toward Hopetown with a yellow bag, the exact opposite direction. And to Lynette's stepmother Kathy Sheffard, a 3rd version, he said the last he saw her, she was swimming toward shore, south toward the boat, north toward Hopetown, toward shore. 3 completely different directions, 3 completely different stories, told to 3 different people who had no way of comparing notes in the moment. A man who just lost his wife in a traumatic accident does not forget which direction she was swimming. He replays that moment constantly. It is burned into him, unless there was no moment to remember. The anchor. Brian Hooker is a former United States Marine, a man who by his own account has spent years living on the water, a man whose friends describe as someone they would trust with their lives in a storm. Yet by his own account, he never dropped anchor while his wife was in the water. Not immediately. Not while he was yelling for her. Not while she was supposedly visible in the water in front of him. A basic seamanship instinct. Stop the boat. Secure your position. Go back for your person. He did not do it. He says he eventually threw the anchor out near Lubber's quarters after an hour of drifting, at a location witnesses say contradicts his story entirely. A former Marine who cannot perform the single most basic act of seamanship in the moment his wife needed him most. The flares. Brian told authorities he fired 2 flares. He told Lynette's mother directly, 2 flares, nothing left. Investigators examined the flare gun. Only one had been discharged. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a flare fired from the soulmate itself, not from the water. From the boat nobody was supposed to be on. What she was wearing. Brian told Fire and Rescue Lynette was wearing a 2-piece black bathing suit. She was also wearing an aquamarine cover-up, a royal blue conch Republic headscarf, likely a black fanny pack. He sent search teams out looking for the wrong description of his own wife. The dry bag. Brian told the security guard Lynette was swimming toward Hopetown with a yellow bag. Lynette's dry bag was green, Brian's was yellow, but the dry bag story does not end there. When Brian arrived at the boatyard at 4 in the morning, security guard Edward Smith saw him carrying a yellow dry bag. That matches Brian's own dry bag color. When Brian boarded the Hopetown Volunteer Fire and Rescue vessel a few hours later, witnesses described the bag differently. One crew member remembered royal blue, another remembered aqua blue. A third did not notice it at all, yellow at the boatyard, blue on the rescue vessel. But here is where it gets significant. One fire and rescue crew member watched Brian throw that aqua dry bag up onto the soulmate when they pulled alongside it that morning. Brian and a police officer then went below deck together for approximately 1 hour. When they came back up, Brian left without the bag. He left it on the Soulmate. That bag is now potentially sitting in evidence at the Coast Guard station in Fort Lauderdale. The terrain. Brian claims that after 9 hours of drifting, he washed up at Marsh Harbor and bushwhacked through scrub, knocked on 2 doors, flagged a car, and eventually reached the boatyard. Volunteer searcher Nathan has now filmed that exact terrain. What he found makes Brian's story physically impossible. The area is filled with black sludge pools, water ravines, mangroves, and impenetrable scrub. Jim Todd of Hopetown Volunteer Fire and Rescue confirmed getting through it would require hours of arduous work, even in daylight with proper equipment. Brian claims he did it at 4 in the morning in blue slides. When Brian boarded the fire and rescue vessel that morning, Jim Todd specifically noted he was wearing blue slides. Clean blue slides. Not a trace of black sludge anywhere on them. You do not walk through black sludge pools at 4 in the morning and step onto a rescue vessel with clean feet. And here is the detail that makes the whole story collapse. As Brian was supposedly drifting toward Marsh Harbor for 9 hours, the boatyard was directly in his line of sight. A large, well-lit facility, the only lights for miles, visible from 150 yards away. Brian changed direction before reaching it. He walked away from the lights, into total darkness, through impossible terrain, to knock on 2 doors nobody answered, flag a car whose driver just left, then somehow find his way back to the boatyard he had been looking at for hours. That is not the behavior of a man desperately seeking help, and not one item belonging to Lynette has ever washed up anywhere in the Sea of Abaco. In water that experts describe as a giant bathtub, shallow, clear, contained, they found nothing. While Brian was supposedly drifting alone in the darkness, something was happening on the Soulmate, something nobody has been able to explain away. Brian has never placed himself back on that boat. In every statement, every interview, every account, he insists he never made it back to the Soulmate that night, which makes what witnesses saw and heard extremely difficult to explain. The splash. Multiple witnesses reported hearing a loud, significant splash at approximately 9:30 that evening, not near where the dinghy was supposed to be, near the Soulmate. Blaine Stevenson, Brian's own friend and a boating expert, described what an anchorage sounds like at sundowner time. Still, quiet, peaceful. In that environment, a massive splash is not background noise. It is an event. People remember it. Witnesses remembered it. The lights. Security footage captured a bright flash of light on the Soulmate just 17 minutes after Brian and Lynette left the Abaco Inn. A second light event was captured around midnight. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a flare fired from the sailboat around 8 p.m. Not fired upward like an emergency signal, fired horizontally from the deck of the Soulmate, the boat nobody was on, the Apple Watch. In photographs taken at the Abaco Inn that evening, Lynette can be seen wearing her powder pink Apple Watch band. That watch was later found on board the Soulmate, the boat Brian says they never reached. Lynette had a habit, confirmed by her daughter Carly, of taking her watch off around dinner time to charge it because the battery was weak. If Lynette bounced off the back of the dinghy before they ever reached the Soulmate, how did her watch end up on board? There is no version of Brian Hooker's story that answers that question. Brian Fitzgibbons, a former Marine and death investigation specialist, confirmed what medical science tells us. A body submerged in warm, shallow water rises. The decomposition process generates gas. The body surfaces, unless it has been deliberately weighted down. Lynette's body has not surfaced. The experts who know these waters are unanimous. If Lynette went overboard where Brian claims, we would have found her. We found nothing. To understand what may have happened on April 4th, you need to understand what was happening long before that night. Lynette and Brian had been together for 25 years, but beneath the surface, people close to Lynette tell a different story. 2 years before she disappeared, Carly says Brian choked her mother, not a momentary act. Deliberate strangulation serious enough that Lynette told her daughter she felt something pop in her neck. After that, Lynette packed a bag and left. 2 months, then she went back. Carly has also stated that Brian threatened to kill Lynette and throw her overboard. Not once, multiple times, a specific repeated threat. In April 2025, Lynette Hooker disappeared from a boat. Her husband says she went overboard. Forensic psychologist Dr. Rachel Tolles broke down what these allegations mean statistically. Prior domestic violence is present in roughly 80% of intimate partner homicide cases. Non-fatal strangulation is one of the strongest single predictors of future lethal violence. Women who have been strangled by a partner are significantly more likely to later be killed by that same partner. Brian Hooker allegedly choked Lynette 2 years before she vanished. He allegedly threatened to throw her overboard multiple times. Every single marker was present. Dr. Tolles described Brian using a term that appears repeatedly in intimate partner homicide profiles: publicly charming, well-liked by people who did not know him well, but behind closed doors, a completely different person. Blaine Stevenson, Brian's own friend, confirmed the couple had separated for nearly 2 months while sailing with their shared community. Everyone knew. And yet Brian looked into cameras and said he had never spent more than 10 days away from his wife. A deliberate lie, for no apparent reason, unless the reason was controlling a narrative. Brian was arrested by Bahamian authorities 5 days after Lynette disappeared. Released when prosecutors determined they needed more evidence. He gave 3 major television interviews saying he would never leave the Bahamas without her, that it would take a higher authority to move him. He had a plane ticket already purchased before those interviews aired. His first action upon release, an emergency passport. His second, leaving the country. As Carly was flying in, Brian was flying out. He has not spoken to Lynette's mother since April 6th, not called Carly, not contacted Lynette's father, blocked people on social media, gone completely dark. Carly Aylesworth turned 29 during this investigation. The man who raised her from age 3 did not reach out, not one word. Darlene Hamlet, Lynette's mother, said it plainly. She believes they made it back to the soulmate that night. She believes they kept drinking. An argument developed, and Brian made the choice he had allegedly threatened to make multiple times before. She believes he choked her daughter. Lynette Hooker trusted this man with her life. She funded the dream. She stepped onto that boat. She loved him even after he gave her reasons not to, and now she is gone. There is one more detail about Brian Hooker's behavior in the hours after Lynette disappeared that has not received enough attention. He had a phone. Brian Hooker worked for AT&T as a certified telephone technician. He wired his entire boat with electronics. He is, by his own description, a self-proclaimed technology expert. He knows better than almost anyone that you can make emergency calls without a SIM card. Every phone on Earth displays it. Emergency calls only. He called nobody. Not Lynette's daughter Carly, not Lynette's mother Darlene, not any family member. Not from the boatyard at 4 in the morning. Not during the 3 hours he sat on shore while fire and rescue mobilized. Not during the search that morning. Not once across an entire day did Brian Hooker pick up a phone and call the family of the woman he allegedly lost in a tragic accident. The Royal Bahamas Police Force issued a press release about a missing American woman at 5:51 p.m. on Easter Sunday, approximately 14 hours after Brian washed up at the boatyard. Within minutes of that press release, Brian called Darlene, not out of grief, not out of desperation, because the police had just gone public and he had no choice. Jim Todd of Hopetown Volunteer Fire and Rescue offered Brian a phone number for a boat rental company so he could go out and help search for his wife. Brian asked for it. Jim Todd gave it to him. Brian never called. And there is something Lynette's friend, Marn, knew. Something Blaine Stevenson's wife knew, that the men in their boating circle were only just learning. Around December 2023, Lynette had sent a message saying she had left Brian, that she couldn't cruise with him anymore, that she could not be alone on a boat with him. She went back, she got on that boat, and she was never seen again. When Lynette was first reported missing, it started as search and rescue. That did not last long. Within days, the investigation shifted. Two parallel criminal investigations running simultaneously. The Royal Bahamas Police Force and the United States Coast Guard Investigative Service, CGS, not the FBI. A specialized federal body with jurisdiction over crimes involving American vessels on the water. When they commit to a case, they do not stop. Brian was arrested by Bahamian authorities on April 9th, 5 days after Lynette disappeared. Questioned for over 3 hours, he broke down in tears, held for 5 days. Released when prosecutors needed more evidence. Release did not mean cleared. Then came the boat. As the soulmate was being transported back to the United States, crewed by 2 men Brian had hired to deliver it. The vessel was intercepted by the Coast Guard approximately 40 miles off the coast of Florida. They pulled alongside, they announced themselves, they boarded, and they took the soulmate. The boat was towed to the Coast Guard station in Fort Pierce, Florida. Crime scene tape placed around the entire vessel. Ashley Banfield's team documented everything. Agents boarding and disembarking daily. Evidence removed and placed into labeled bags at a processing table on the dock. Aerial footage showing crime scene tape visible from both water and air. Brian Hooker would not be getting his boat back. And now, the forensic processing of the soulmate is complete. The heavy lifting is done. Whatever was on that boat, whatever the agents were carrying off in those evidence bags across multiple weeks of active examination, is now in the hands of investigators. They reserve the right to return for follow-up processing, as any active crime scene allows. But the primary forensic work on the soulmate is finished. That means, whatever story the soulmate tells, investigators already know it. Lynette's mother Darlene called the seizure of the soulmate her Mother's Day present. Because what that crime scene tape represented was a public, undeniable signal. Federal investigators believe something happened on that vessel, not on the dinghy, not in the water half a mile from shore, on the soulmate. Defense attorney Josh Coles, who has been publicly defending Brian throughout, quietly advised his client to prepare for the possibility of arrest and charges. A defense attorney preparing his client for arrest is not the language of a man who believes his client is about to be exonerated. Brian Hooker is a self-described technology geek. He connects everything, logs everything, trusts his gear. But here is something important about Brian Hooker and technology that has just come to light. Brian was fired from AT&T, not for poor performance, not for missing targets. He was fired because he was caught masking the GPS location of his work van, manipulating his location data so his employer could not track where he actually was. He was caught. He was warned it happened again. Third time he was gone. This is not a minor detail. This tells us Brian Hooker has a documented history of understanding how GPS tracking works and deliberately defeating it. He knows what location data can reveal. He knows how to hide it. He has done it before. And he was living on a boat loaded with GPS-enabled electronics on the night his wife disappeared. Because here is what experienced investigators understand. You can delete messages going forward. You can wipe devices. You can throw a phone overboard. But you cannot reach back into the past and erase what systems you do not control have already recorded. The cloud does not forget. And the soulmate was not just a boat. It was a data archive. Starlink. The soulmate had a Starlink satellite system mounted on the mast. When a device comes within range and connects, that connection is logged, time stamped, device identified. Brian says they never made it back to the soulmate. He says he drifted 4 miles in the opposite direction. If any device he was carrying connected to Starlink that night, the logs will show it. Investigators have the boat, they have the system, they have the logs, the FLIR camera. There is a thermal imaging camera, a FLIR camera mounted on the mast of the soulmate. Many live-aboard sailors keep these running constantly so they can check on their boat remotely from shore. Real-time night vision capable. If that camera was operating on the night of April 4th, it may have recorded exactly what happened in and around that anchorage between 7:41 p.m. and 4 a.m., including whether a dinghy made it back to the Soulmate, including what happened after. Brian is a tech geek who knows his systems. He may have known that camera was running. He may have addressed it. But investigators now have the boat and everything on it. If that footage exists anywhere, on the device, in a connected app, in a cloud backup, they will find it. The AI maps. Brian created annotated maps of his claimed dinghy route and sent them to friends and fire and rescue teams as official search documentation. Ashley Banfield studied those maps carefully. They looked AI-generated. She investigated. Brian had used Google's Gemini to create them. That opened a question investigators are almost certainly pursuing. What else did he use Gemini for that night? What prompts did he enter? At what times? Because AI platforms log user activity, prompts, timestamps, device used, location in many cases. If Brian opened Gemini on the night of April 4th and searched for things only someone managing the aftermath of a crime would need, those logs exist on a server he does not control. Google has received warrants in true crime cases before. Search histories have been read aloud in courtrooms. They have contributed to convictions. The watches. Brian wears GPS-enabled smartwatches connected to apps, syncing location data to the cloud. The man who masked his GPS at AT&T was wearing a device that tracked his every movement on the night Lynette disappeared. When Bahamian authorities detained him, they returned his watch without examining it. Investigators have expressed frustration about that, but watch data syncs to cloud platforms, apps, fitness trackers. Those platforms can be reached with warrants even if the watch itself is gone. The NT300 engine. Lynette texted friends excitedly about their new NT300 electric dinghy engine, a smart motor with Bluetooth capability that logs telemetric data to its battery. That data could show exactly where the dinghy went on the night of April 4th. But here is the problem. The dinghy being held by Bahamian police does not have the NT300 on it. It has the old Torpedo engine, the previous engine, the one that was supposed to have been replaced. Where is the NT300? Where are its batteries? Where is the telemetric data showing everywhere that dinghy traveled that night? Brian got his dinghy back before he was considered a suspect. He had days of unsupervised access to it. He then flew out of the Bahamas. The batteries and all the data they contain are unaccounted for. Lynette's Apple Watch, found on the Soulmate, the boat they never reached. Lynette took her watch off around dinner to charge it because the battery was weak. If she removed it and placed it on the charger on the Soulmate, they made it back to that boat. Brian's entire account collapses at its foundation. The scuba tanks, filled 2 days before she disappeared. No diving on April 3rd or 4th. Those tanks should be full. If one is depleted, investigators will want to know why. Ashley Banfield has outlined a theory. Scuba gear represents a way to move something heavy through water in darkness without a boat. Tahiti Beach is 1 minute from the anchorage. The Atlantic side of Elbow Cay is on the other side of the island. Deep water, strong currents, very different recovery odds to the Sea of Abaco. It is a theory. Brian has not been charged. But the tanks are on the Soulmate. The Soulmate processing is complete. If those tanks tell a story, investigators already know it. Brian built his life around technology. He connected everything. He even knew how to defeat GPS tracking. He had done it before at AT&T. But defeating a work van's GPS is very different from defeating Starlink logs, FLIR camera footage, AI query records, watch app data, battery telemetrics, and the forensic evidence of a 46-foot sailing vessel that the United States Coast Guard has been processing for weeks. He thought he was smart enough. We will find out if he was right. 6 weeks after she was last seen alive, Lynette Hooker has not been found. Not her green dry bag. Not her headscarf, not her cover-up, not her fanny pack. Not one item from her body that evening has turned up anywhere along the shores of the Abacos, in water that experts unanimously call one of the most searchable stretches of ocean in the world. That absence is not a mystery to the people who know these waters. It is a conclusion. If Lynette had gone overboard where Brian claims, they would have found something. The Sea of Abaco is shallow, 4 to 15 feet, clear, contained by land, a bathtub. Search and rescue professionals swept it thoroughly. They found nothing belonging to Lynette, which means wherever she is, she did not go overboard from that dinghy. Two possibilities have been consistently raised by people close to this investigation: burial. Along the water's edge of the surrounding islands, there are stretches of soft sand just above the high tide line. Accessible from the water, workable in darkness, not obviously disturbed to a casual observer the next morning. Local volunteer Nathan has been walking these shorelines and documenting his searches on video. The geography makes this theory physically possible. The Atlantic. On the other side of Elbow Cay is the open Atlantic, deep water, strong currents, dramatically different recovery probabilities. Something placed there in darkness would not easily be found. Ashley Banfield has outlined how Tahiti Beach, 1 minute from the anchorage, creates a potential transit point between the calm leeward side and the open ocean. Both are theories. Brian has not been charged, but the people who know these waters best say the same thing consistently. Lynette did not go overboard from that dinghy, which means wherever she is, she was placed there deliberately. There is something else that has just emerged about the soulmate itself. On May 22, 2025, the vessel was moved, towed 100 miles south from the Coast Guard station in Fort Pierce, Florida, all the way to the Coast Guard station in Fort Lauderdale. The forensic processing is complete. The evidence has been removed. And now investigators appear to be preparing the soulmate for long-term preservation. The working assumption among people close to this investigation is that the boat will be hauled out of the water and placed into dry dock, protected from the elements, secured from any deterioration, until trial. Brian Hooker is not getting that boat back. Not for years, possibly not ever. And there is one more thing that Blaine Stevenson raised that deserves to be said clearly. Nobody is searching for Lynette. Not officially, not comprehensively. The Royal Bahamas Police Force conducted a search on the morning of April 5th with fire and rescue. And then it stopped. There has been no coordinated official search of the islands, the shorelines, the beaches, or the waters since. Blaine Stevenson has been in contact with Darlene Hamlet. Both of them want the same thing: permission to bring professionals into the Bahamas and conduct a proper search, not for evidence, not for a conviction, for Lynette. Because, as Blaine said directly, Brian being arrested guilty or innocent does not find Lynette. And every year that passes without finding her is another year of reopened wounds for Darlene and for Carly. A green dry bag found on a Bahamian shore 5 years from now is a new scar for that family. Lynette deserves to be found, not as a crime scene, as a person, as somebody's daughter, as somebody's mother. The search has not happened yet, but the people who love her are not giving up. Darlene Hamlet, Lynette's mother, shared her own theory quietly and without drama. She believes they made it back to the soulmate. She believes an argument developed. She believes Brian made the choice he had allegedly threatened to make before. She does not say it with anger. She says it with the exhaustion of a mother who has been waiting 6 weeks for her daughter to come home. Carly Aylesworth turned 29 during this investigation without her mother. She has spoken publicly when speaking was the hardest thing she could do. She has kept this story alive because it is the only tool she has. There are photographs of Lynette that her mother shared during this investigation. Not sailing photos, childhood pictures. Lynette as a little girl with her brother. A wedding day photo with her father. Skiing with her mother on a snowy slope somewhere in Michigan. Laughing, alive, surrounded by people who loved her. That is who Lynette Hooker was before she became a headline. A daughter, a mother, a woman of warmth and generosity who trusted the wrong person with her life. She deserves to be found. If you have any information about Lynette Hooker's disappearance, please submit a tip through the CGS Tips app available on both the Apple App Store and Google Play. Tips are completely anonymous. Brian Hooker has not been charged with any crime. That fact matters and it must be respected. But here is what is also true. A woman is missing, a woman who sold everything to fund a dream, who texted her daughter constantly, who wore a powder pink Apple Watch band and laughed on ski slopes with her mother. Her husband told a story that does not hold up, not on the weather, not on the timeline, not on the flares, not on the dry bag, not on the Apple Watch found on a boat they never reached, not on the splash near the soulmate, not on the lights nobody can explain, not on 9 hours of drifting, not on the man who drove away. The federal government has seized that vessel. Crime scene tape surrounds it. Digital systems, Starlink, navigation logs, battery records, security cameras, all being examined by people who are methodical, resourced, and patient. The AI queries made that night, the GPS data in watch applications, the Starlink connection logs, the scuba tanks filled 2 days before she vanished. All of it is being looked at. Brian Hooker trusted his own intelligence. He thought he had controlled the narrative. He gave 3 television interviews and boarded a plane the same night. He allegedly threatened to throw his wife overboard more than once. The investigation is not finished. This story is not finished. And at the final record, we do not move on when the headlines do. We stay with the cases that matter. We follow the evidence. We keep asking the questions that deserve answers. When something breaks in this case, and something will break, you need to be here. As this video was being prepared, federal investigators confirmed that GPS data recovered from Brian Hooker's devices has led the U.S. Coast Guard to request permission to send dive teams to 2 specific locations in the Sea of Abaco. Locations Brian Hooker never mentioned to investigators. The truth is getting closer. Subscribe to The Final Record right now. Hit the notification bell. Because the moment an indictment drops, the moment a body is found, the moment the digital evidence aboard that soulmate tells investigators what Brian Hooker was doing on the night of April 4th, we will be the first place covering it. Lynette Hooker deserves the truth. We will not stop until she gets it.